Hello, and welcome to Math Matters. I'm Mrs. Halpin, and today we are going to make observations and interpret data shown in a circle graph. For this lesson, you will need paper and a pencil or something else to write with. A calculator would also be helpful, but definitely not required. We'll pause for a moment while you gather those materials. Now that you're ready, let's get started. There are a couple of learning goals for today's lesson. We'll have one math goal and one portrait of a graduate goal. Let's take a look at today's math goal first. I am learning to make observations and interpret data shown in a circle graph. I hope that by the end of today's lesson, you'll be able to interpret a circle graph using your understanding of fractions, decimals, and percents. Our portrait of a graduate goal is focused on being goal-directed and resilient. Our goal today is around persevering through difficult tasks and situations. That means that you keep on trying and don't give up even when things get hard. Let's jump into today's lesson. Let's take a look at this circle graph. You'll notice that there are missing parts. I'm going to slowly give you some more and more information. But until then, let's make sense of what we see. What do you notice? What do you wonder? You might have noticed that there are 5 colors. You also might have noticed that half of this circle is blue, or that the purple, the lighter purple, appears to be less than 1/4 of the entire circle. You may have even noticed that if you combine the two smallest portions, they appear to be equal to the tan portion of the graph. You might be wondering, what is the graph about? Let's get a little bit more information. We now see that this graph is about Kara's budget. A budget is a certain amount of money that you have to spend on something. For example, you may have an $80 budget to spend on clothing when you go shopping. You have to make sure you don't spend more than your budget. So let's take a look at Kara's budget. What might Kara spend her money on? What do you think each of these colors represent? Why? Now that you've had a little bit of time to think about what categories might fit in this graph, let's get a little bit more information. Look at the new information given to us. What are you noticing now about Kara's budget? You may be noticing that Kara spends 15% of her budget on clothes and only 10% of her budget on entertainment. You may have also noticed that so far she spent 30% of her budget on clothes, entertainment, and other things. This means that she still has 70% of her budget to spend. You may have realized that we can figure out the percentages of the missing categories just by using what we know. It looks like the blue portion is 1/2, and we know 1/2 is equivalent to 50%. If we add the total of the categories we do know to the blue category, we get 80%. So far we've added the categories, the percentages of the categories that we do know. This must mean that the purple category accounts for 20% of Kara's budget. I'm wondering, what are the two categories that Kara spends most of her budget on? We can now see that that lighter purple category represents the amount of Kara's budget that she spends on food, and that was in fact 20% of her budget. What do you think the last portion of Kara's budget is spent on? Remember, that last portion is about 1/2. I wonder what she spends 1/2 of her money on. Was your prediction correct? Did you guess that Kara spends the largest portion of her budget on rent? Let's dive into the question. If Kara's budget was $100 for this circle graph, how much would she spend on each category? Imagine that this grid square represents Kara's entire $100 budget. If rent was 50% of Kara's budget, it would be 50 out of the 100 squares. We can see that Kara spent 5% of her budget on other things. That means that 5 out of the 100 squares represents the other category. We can also see that 10 out of the 100 squares represents entertainment, and 15 out of the 100 squares represents clothing. The remaining 20 squares represents the 20% of Kara's budget that she spends on food. Now let's look at what this means and connect it to money. We can see how Kara's $100 budget is broken down with the grid squares in money. If each individual square represents $1 of her budget, Kara can spend $50 on rent, $20 on food, $15 on clothing, $10 on entertainment, and the remaining $5 on other things. Now let's look at how the amount spent on each category would change if Kara's overall budget changed. Kara's new budget is $250. I can use what I know about the previous budget of $100 to help me think about her new budget. I can break up the $250 into two groups of 100 and one group of 50. To represent this, we can include one grid for each $100 and half of a grid for the $50. We know from Kara's old budget that for every $100, she spent $50 on rent, $20 on food, $15 on clothing, $10 on entertainment, and another $5 on other things. We can show that with each of these first two groups of 100. However, the last grid only shows $50, requiring me to think about it differently. If I think of $50 as half of $100, then each category should be half of the amount it was previously. Now that we've represented each category of Kara's $250 budget, let's figure out how much money she spent on each part of her budget. Since we broke Kara's budget into 3 parts, let's look at the first part, or the first $100 of her budget. We know from before that she spent $50 on rent, $20 on food, $15 on clothing, $10 on entertainment, and an additional $5 on other things. We can do the same thing with the second part of her budget as well. We can see that with the second $100, each category will be the same amount. Now let's look at the last $50 of Kara's budget. We know that 50 is half of 100, so the amounts will have to be half of the $100 section. Finally, if Kara's entire budget is $250, we would need to add up or find the sum in each row to get the total amount she spent for each category. If we add up the totals for rent, food, clothing, entertainment, and other, we will have 100% of Kara's total budget, or $250. In the first example we looked at, Kara's budget was $100, and that represented the whole. In the second example we looked at, the whole changed to $250. That was her new budget. $250 represents our new whole. On the left, we can see that the rent accounted for 50% of Kara's budget. Since her budget was $250, that means that $125 of her $250 was spent on rent, or half of the $250 was spent on rent. When we find the amount represented in each category, it needs to add up to 100% of her $250 budget. We will continue exploring this idea in upcoming lessons. In today's episode of Math Matters, we learned about how to make observations and interpret data shown in circle graphs. How do you feel about your ability to read and interpret circle graphs? Reflect on how you did working towards these goals today and give a thumbs up if you got it, a thumb in the middle if you're still practicing, or a thumb down if you feel like you need help from a teacher or someone at home. I encourage you to share any questions you might have had today with your teachers. I'm Mrs. Halpin. I hope you have a great day and keep on counting.